We have Andrew Wisdom here, and I thought he was a bit arrogant calling his business Distilled Wisdom until I remembered that was his last name. Andrew has addressed a wide range of transport and urban development challenges throughout his 30-year career. As the Director of Distilled Wisdom, he believes the way we use our cities needs to change if they are to flourish into the future and meet the needs of all residents to live long, healthy, productive and fulfilling lives. Could you please make him most welcome to Bendigo, Australia?
I love having an excuse to come to Bendigo because, well, particularly my wife is over here is looking forward to going to the underwear exhibition next door. But I love your gallery. Isn't that a fantastic place? It's so good. Really good. So one of the things Ian was talking about before was people having permission to change. Really? You're talking about having a great group of councillors who are focused on the idea of change. And I think it's a really important thing. What that just reminded me about was the idea of change and choices. And what we tend to do is to think that the choice is between things staying the same and change, something changing. In fact, that's a false choice. Things staying the same as they were in the past, looking back to the past and saying that's what we want things to be, either stay there like that, or to recreate the past, why do you want to try and do that, versus doing something different, that cannot happen. That is not the choice you're making. The past is past, it's not going to come back. What you have to choose between is different types of futures. And once you actually free yourself up to allow yourself to accept that kind of an idea, then the conversation becomes completely different. Because it's not about saying, no, we don't want to do something different because we want to keep doing the things we've been doing in the past. You're going to be doing something different. What different thing are you going to be doing? And that's a really interesting and open kind of conversation. So I want to talk about what Bendigo's transport system is for, and I'll nail my colours to the mast right now. I think the transport system needs to be in service of creating a great Bendigo and allowing the Bendigo that you like to grow and get better and all of those kinds of good things. The transport system is not there for its own purpose. It's not there just to satisfy its own needs. So I'm going to talk about 6 little blobs, and I have to go really quick because I'm not going to be talking for very long. I'm going to talk a little about the public realm, and public realm is where we gather, and it includes the streets. And in fact, in a lot of cities, in most cities of the world, the public realm space that's taken up by streets is a very substantial part of the public realms. Most of the space you've got. Why would you give that over just to cars? Then I'm going to talk about, be a little bit provocative, I suppose, about the idea of needing a licence to even enter a street. I'm going to talk about bike helmets for a minute, just as I can. Then I'm going to talk about parking. And then I'm going to use those 3 things just to spring off and to talk about recapturing the public realm, which is what I think ITLUS is about. ITLUS is about you guys being able to recapture your public realm and making the most of it you can. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about just some reflections on ITLUS itself. So, what is the public realm for? So here's, I don't know, who's been to one of those dinky little old cities in Europe, or the Middle East, or even Africa, right? Yeah, plenty of you have done. And they're kind of like this, aren't they? Well, not everywhere's like this, but this is the kind of stuff you see on the streets of those kinds of cities. This is what cities were like. This is what they were for up until the middle of the 19th century. Up there in the left-hand side, we've got a guy making some chairs. I think it's probably in Naples, and there's people selling shirts and people hanging their washing out to dry. People on the right-hand side just having a chat. That's what streets were for. It was just where people did stuff, right? You lived at home, but then you got out on the street, and that's where you did stuff. That's one model. This is Bendigo. These are all photos about Bendigo. Well, the ones apart from the bit on the right. What do you see there? What's in those photos? No cars. I mean, cars are no people. Look at it. Are there any people at all in them? Is that a person there? There might be a person over there. Yeah, there are probably some drivers in the cars. Although that won't go for much longer, right? So that is the 20th century model. And that started back in the 19th century with the construction of grand boulevards in Paris. And then all of Australia's boom time cities, and Bendigo is one of those, Melbourne's another one, were constructed on a very recognisable template of wide boulevards, which, lo and behold, are really good for carrying lots and lots of cars. So what happened in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of cars was that all of that public realm space for us, got taken over for one purpose, and that was to carry cars. And, a whole institutional arrangement arose to support that. So Vic Roads people here, I know John Snell, former Vic Roads member here. Are there Vic Roads people here? Oh, okay. So places like Vic Roads, they're not the enemy, they're the good guys, but they're part of a whole industry around making roads work for their primary purpose, and their primary purpose was seen as carrying cars. So of course, roads are wide, they need to get wider because traffic grows, and so on and so forth. And as a result, all the other uses that used to be in the public realm, all that stuff, is pushed to the sides, literally pushed to the sides, onto the footpaths, right on the side of the road. And is seen as just something you have to, one of those additional things you've got to deal with. And they're a bit of a nuisance. And as a result, everything moves off the streets. You look at those streets, and now we're repopulating the footpaths with sidewalk cabs. Had a nice breakfast just over the road there today. But everything else moves inside. And just as a bit of a sidebar, where do they move inside to? They move into shopping malls. That's America's gift to the world of the 20th century, and they're now in the process of evolving into something else. But one of the things you need to remember is that space inside those shopping malls is not public space. So if the owner of that shopping mall wants to close it, or if he doesn't want you to be in there, that's it. It's not your right to be in there. So this really interesting thing is that down the bottom is a photo called the Mall Walkers of America, which is this group of middle-aged people who go, when it's hot in the southern states, they go walking inside malls because they're air-conditioned and there are toilets and there are places to have cups of coffee and that sort of stuff. But they have this ongoing battle with the mall owners because they get there early and they park in the best parking spaces. And they use the toilets without buying anything, And so there's this battle between the people who would otherwise be walking in the streets, who just want to walk, go walk and get some exercise, populating and stuff. So that's a really interesting thing. So that's a really interesting change in the way, in the last 50, 100 years, that we have used our public realm. And our streets are part of the public realm. Lewis Mumford was a very famous thinker about cities. Access to every building in the city by private motor car in an age when everyone possesses such a vehicle is actually the right to destroy the city. And I reckon cars are killing our cities. Not that we don't want to have cars. I don't think there's any time soon when there won't be cars around. But they need to play their part, but not be the only thing. So that's what the public realm's about. Why do we need a licence to enter a street? Here we are, here's a photo of Pall Mall in, I don't know, I have 1904 sticks in my mind, it may not be 1904, but kind of that kind of time. And what do you see there? See people walking down the middle of the street, right? Not many people, right? Here's somebody is watering his horses, not bad. Here's a woman with her daughter just strolling across the middle of the road. Everyone's just wandering around. There's a tram cruising past there. There's no particular issue, right? There's not much congestion. There's no queue of horse buggies. But, nevertheless, people, obviously, the pedestrians didn't see that it was wrong to be walking in the middle of the road. What's that like now? Here we go. I like this guy. He's running to avoid these guys. Well, maybe he's trying to run into the car. I don't know. But, he's obviously he's a visitor in that space. So what do we have now? Now we have, if you want to get onto the road, if you want to be in the middle of the road, try what? Tell you what, here's an experiment, which you might want to do, say, tomorrow lunchtime. Go down to Pall Mall and just stand in the middle of the road, not where the tram tracks are, but just in the middle of the traffic lane, and close your eyes. In fact, better still, lie down. How comfortable do you think you'd feel there? You're a visitor in that space. In fact, you're an intruder in that space, right? You shouldn't be there. In fact, you could probably be prosecuted for doing that. So the only way onto that tarmac is if you've got a licence to drive a car and you're in a car, or you get a temporary permit every now and again to cross that road at a pedestrian crossing. So there are spaces along the place where you're allowed every now and again when you're given permission by the green man to walk across that road. That's the only way you can get into that space legally. This is the majority of your public space. Why is that the case? Why do we live that much like that? So this is photos from most of them from around Bendigo, but about getting kids to school. And here are these poor people somewhere, one of the surrounding towns, can't even get across to the school because there's no pedestrian crossing. I like this one up here as well. This is a pedestrian crossing that a taxi's just decided to stop in the middle of. It's okay to do that, right? So in my street we have hard rubbish collections. I'm sure you all have hard rubbish collections every now and again. You don't? That's next Sunday, right? Next Sunday we're going to talk about that. Let's not talk about that now. Anyway, we are lucky enough to have hard rubbish collections in our street.
You're just straight off course.
Yeah, stay on target. But the reason I brought that up, I wish I hadn't, but I'm going to finish that. The reason I brought that up was because somebody chucked out a whole bunch of stuff, as they do. Actually, we don't, whatever, it doesn't matter. They put it, and where did they put it? They put it on the side of the footpath. There was no way to walk down the footpath to get around that stuff. You have to walk into the road. It's okay to block the footpath with your rubbish. It wouldn't be right to put it in the middle of the road to block it, to put your rubbish. I just thought it was really interesting. Anyway, so you need a license to get into streets. It doesn't have to be like that. This is Oxford Circus in London. Anybody been to Oxford Circus? Anybody been there recently? I remember vividly being in the top one. This was up until about a couple of years ago. And you can see what's happened. This is the straight line thinking that engineers employ. I'm an engineer, so I can talk about the straight line thinking that engineers use. You know, it's a very busy corner, Regent Street, Oxford Street, millions of buses running up and down in every direction you possibly can. Pedestrians get in the way, so pedestrians are pushed out of the way. So each of the corners has a fence. You probably can't see it on that clear. Oh, that come here. So pedestrians push it out, they cross the road. Away from the intersection, way down here, out of the way, so the traffic connection isn't compromised by having people in the way. It was a really hopeless place to be. It's always crowded because there's a tube station directly underneath that intersection. So there's people everywhere, and you're stuck. You're wedged between the buildings and the fences. It was a really unpleasant place to be. A couple of years ago, Transport for London said this is enough is enough, and they redesigned the intersections, the middle photo, and designed it in a way to suit the needs, the desire lines of where people want it to go, which is shown. Oh, you can't see it. And where do people want to go? You can probably just make out these little blurry bits of people walking. Everybody's doing this, which they couldn't do before because it didn't suit the traffic. But now it's been redesigned. So it doesn't have to be the way we don't have to organise our public realm the way we have in the past. We can do it differently, and it's okay. This actually isn't very controversial. This is just a redesign of the street. That's no drama. More interesting, I think, is a group of 8 or 9 towns in Europe where they have, for each of the 8 or 9 towns, they've taken away all intersection traffic controls. See? That's scary, right? They just said, you know what? We're going to operate in a different kind of way. If you want to cross through an intersection in our town, you're going to have to negotiate your way across that. You crash into somebody, that's your problem. And so what do people do? They just inch their way across, right? So these cars going across, this bike's going here. I think this looks a little bit staged, doesn't it? But anyway, you've got a guy standing in the middle of the intersection chatting to somebody driving a car. It's probably his wife, and saying, what did you just buy at the shops? Or whatever. But it's a different way of operating an intersection. It doesn't have to be the way we do it. And these guys, the results of these... do you know this guy?
Yeah. Can everyone say, hi, Mikey, the tech guy? Yeah.
That's my train of thought. Yeah, but so there's been no perceptible traffic problems, no perceptible safety problems. It's quicker, it's less delay. Everything's better. And you don't have to, there's not, the road isn't given over entirely to cars. It's a space that everybody can use. It'd be interesting to think how that would work here in Australia, wouldn't it? Okay. But it's really interesting to think you can do things differently. It's okay. The way we do it now doesn't have to be the way we do it. Okay, that's about accessing the street. Let's talk about bike helmets. Here's, the European/Asian approach to riding bikes. Does anybody notice anything interesting and unusual? No helmets, right? I love this one. Can you imagine this woman in Australia? Is she going to be riding a bike? Wow, I think so. What do we have in Australia? What do you see there? Bike helmets. And I was trying to think what the analogy was. My wife pulled me up from using an inappropriate one. But I think the thing is, it's a specialist sport in Australia, isn't it? You want to be a bike rider, you've got to have the gear, right? You've got to have the $10,000 bike, you've got to have the bike helmet, and you're riding a peloton, you're riding 1 million miles an hour down Beach Road in Melbourne, I'm sure there's equivalents here, and you kill pedestrians who step in your way and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, you have middle-aged men in lycra, mammals, and you have very old men in tights, bonnets.
And they park their bike and drive to work.
And then they park their bike and drive to work. Exactly right. It's a special sport, right? It's a thing you do. You play golf, or you play footy, or you go bike riding. And good on them for doing that. This is the participation rate, people riding bikes to work. And you can see, with the exception of the ACT, you can't see the key, I know, I'll tell you, the ACT is the one going up, everyone else is going down. So as a community, we have created this environment where bike riding is a bit safer because you've got to wear helmets. I had a debate with my wife last night about whether or not that was actually the case, but anyway, let's pretend that forcing everyone to wear helmets makes life safer. But in the process of creating that bike riding culture, we're actually discouraging people from riding bikes. So, you know, could you imagine this woman? She's not going to put on a helmet and ride in a peloton with her lycra on, is she? I mean, you know. No. Whereas, you know, this is absolutely routine. I love the guy on the right-hand side, the guy sitting on the pannier on the back of his girlfriend's bike. I think it's a beauty. Anyway, so that's about bike riding. Is parking good for shops? So, you know, we all know about parking. Here we go. These are Bendigo cars parked. But the whole idea about the approach to parking, the second half 20th century approach to parking, is that it's designed to make sure everybody that wants to drive to a shop can do that and park without problems. And the result is this is from Texas, this photo, I love this photo. And this is the culture you are pointing at. If you do that, if you want to go to the Lowe's over on the right-hand side, a hardware store, and you want to then come over to Denny's or something over here, you've got to drive. There's absolutely no way to walk across it. If you could actually raise the energy to walk the 200 metres from one of those to the other, there's no way across. There's no footpath, there's nothing. You have to drive. So that mindset that underpins that way of designing a city drives the kind of behaviour that results in everybody needing a four-lane road or a vast amount of parking. Look how much of the actual land uses can you see there? You can't. It's all about the forecourt parking. You think that's pretty weird, but, you know, there's the Bunnings in Bendigo, right? It's exactly the same thing. We drove on the way in, we passed a Woolworths, exactly the same thing. That is what you're creating, this awful environment. Why would you do that? You don't have to do that. So, 5 minutes. Recapturing the public realm. So I'm now warming to my theme, right? So, I think the ITLUS is around build a community and recapturing the public realm. So how do you do that? Well, here's Melbourne, you know. I come from Melbourne, it's justly got its laneway culture. Everybody from Sydney always tells me about Melbourne's laneway culture. It wasn't always like that. You know, Melbourne CBD used to be pretty bad. If you want to see what Melbourne CBD used to be like, go to Sydney. It used to be 5 o'clock. It was an office environment. Everybody just went home. The City Council had this great program of attracting people to live into the CBD, which then created demand for supermarkets and cafes, and they relaxed the licensing laws so bars and restaurants could operate more cheaply, which meant they could operate, so you could then recolonise the lanes and so on, and the rest is history. It's about getting people out on their feet, walking around the city. I just think it's a lovely story. It's a lovely story. So how do you do that here in Bendigo? You have events, everybody has events, I suppose. You're a series of events from Bendigo, and they're fine as far as they go, but they're not routine, right? They're getting people out and about, but like once every now and again. Here we all are today, but it doesn't happen every day. It's just a special event because of the events. So how do you do it more routinely? Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. You can get your kids to play in the street. And what's involved in creating an environment where your kids can play in the street? And Paul, you're probably going to talk about that a little bit more, so I'll just leave that now. And I think that's a great thing. And somebody on the table at the start here was telling us about how her kids play in the street. I think that's great. You start up community gardens, so you get to know your neighbours. This is about creating communities. I mean, you all knew each other, obviously, before you came here, because you were all shouting at each other before we started. So, maybe that's not such a big deal here, but it's really important to actually build communities, because people at the moment live in dormitory suburbs where they don't know anybody. You can go your whole life without actually meeting your neighbours, which is a pretty awful thing to do. Or you can do guerrilla gardening. I love the idea of guerrilla gardening. You just do the gardening and don't ask permission from anyone. It's a really nice thing, because it's about empowering stuff. It's a really good thing. So that's recapturing the public realm. Finally, I just want to quickly talk about ITLUS. And in the context of building a community, I think it's really interesting to think about how you might do that. So, I don't know, well, in Melbourne, recently we did a strategic plan, similar kind of thing to this, and came up, used the idea of a 20-minute city. And I know here, Trevor was telling me you were talking about a 10-minute city, which I think is great. The trouble with the Melbourne model was he said, oh, let's have a 20-minute city, and all the sort of people who would say this go, oh, you're never going to be able to do a 20-minute city, it's a silly idea, you're never going to do that, because we all have to drive into the city to work and so on and so forth, which is not what it's about. It came from Portland in Oregon about 10 years ago, and what they actually did in Portland was to have a thing called a complete neighbourhood, and that's morphed into the idea of 20-minute city, complete neighbourhood. But what they did was they created a series of measures. So they said, what do we mean by a complete neighbourhood? And this is where Melbourne fell down. It didn't actually use any measures. It just said, oh, we want to have a 20-minute city, which sounds kind of groovy. But what does it mean? Portland actually went to the extent of actually defining it. And for them, and it was relevant for them. So for them, it was about making it walkable. And walkable meant having a footpath in every street, which seems a pretty modest aspiration, I have to tell you. But anyway, that was one of the things that was important for them. Rideable, so by bike you can get to a bikeway. Public transport, and they had various measures around what kind of level of public transport you should be able to have in a complete neighbourhood. And access to a park, and that one travelled all the way across the country, so New York City now has an aspiration to have a park within 10 minutes of everybody's house. Maybe you have issues with parks, I don't know. Healthy food, have a healthy food store within half a mile, which is about a kilometre, isn't it? So you can actually walk to a place where you can buy something other than a big bag. Commercial services, have some form of employment in the local area and have a primary school in the area. So that for them is how they framed a complete neighbourhood. And the great thing about doing that was they could then map it. So here's Portland. Yellow is good, through yellow and pink through purple, which is not so good. And that tells you where you have to spend your effort, put your effort in. So they've, they then, as a result of having mapped their neighbourhoods, they can then come up with a program. And you don't have to understand this particularly, but say population projection is low versus high. And then they could map the needs depending on what the future scenario was. Where should we spend our money? Which neighbourhoods should we spend our effort in improving? So how do we need to underpin how best can we underpin our neighbourhoods? So that's the Portland thing, and I would commend it. And Trevor was saying he's got close connections to Portland, so you never know, you might see some of that Portland action here. Which then brings me to transport. So if you can live locally, that's to say satisfy your basic daily needs at a local level. Sure, you travel across town, but you don't have to travel across town to get your food. And a central plank in that is the local milk bar, I reckon. You had, how many of you, did you say, Trevor? 90. You just have 90 and now you're down to about 30, so you just save every milk bar you can. How you actually make them profitable, that is a challenge, but whatever. And then you need to underpin that with ways of getting around the city. Now, not everybody wants to drive. Let's say you want to create a city where it's possible not to drive to get across the city. And in fact, for plenty of people, they have to not drive. They don't have a licence, they're either too young, or they're unwell, or whatever. So public transport, a viable public transport network is a really important underpinning framework for a successful city. Now, there's some stuff in the news recently about maybe reviving the tram network. I know people have fond memories of the trams. On the bottom left is the last Eagle Hawk tram. And I'm guessing, based on the guy standing on the rainboard with his shorts and long socks, it's probably in the 70s sometime. What do you have with shorts and long socks? You probably don't remember, you're too young. So, so that's that. But trams, I've got to tell you, it's a really hard gig to make a tram a worthwhile thing. Melbourne struggles, and its tram network is still intact. Implementing a new tram network, they don't work that well. They go slowly, they run on tracks, obviously, so they're limited on where they go, and they fall between needing to get people across town quickly versus distributing them in a fine-grained way. So you've got to think about that. But luckily, you have an alternative, right? You have your heavy rail network. which I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You could create a metropolitan rail network. In fact, it already exists. All you have to do is to create some more stations, use those stations as community hubs, so develop them around those stations, put in some feeder services around to the areas around there, and you have a fantastic public transport service. What an aspiration. I just think it's fantastic. And they don't have to be big trains, they can be those little suckers on the right hand side, it could be a one-car set if you like, it could be a tram, running on the heavy rail network. And that would be such a great outcome, I reckon. And all of that is about you guys taking control of your future. It's about this community that you represent actually saying what you want to do. Choosing, not choosing to try to stay the way things have been in the past, because that is not going to happen. But to take that possibility of change and changing the way you want it to go, not the way it's going to overwhelm you. Thanks, Eric. Thank you, Andrew.